Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the Spanish-American War. For a lot of people, it comes as a surprise that America was ever at war with Spain. It's a pretty much forgotten event in U.S. history. But for a few months in 1898, Spain and the United States were belligerents. Let's start by setting the scene of the late 1800s. The Spanish Empire was dying. It had begun shortly after Columbus mistakenly found the Western Hemisphere. Some people get upset when others use the term that Columbus discovered America. Obviously, there were millions of people living here in the Western Hemisphere when Columbus arrived. Further, we know that Leif Erikson and the Vikings arrived about 500 years before Columbus, and that some Asians may have arrived on the west coast of the Americas long before Columbus sailed. The critical element is that Columbus showed Europeans that there were vast lands across the Atlantic and, more importantly, how to get here. So Columbus clearly did not discover the Americas, but he did discover a way for Europeans to get to the Western Hemisphere. And it was that discovery, how to get here and back, that caused enormous changes throughout the entire world. There were other European powers like Britain and France, but in the 1490s, only Portugal and Spain were seriously exploring the world. This brings us to the Treaty of Tordesillas. That was a treaty signed between Portugal and Spain in June 1494, dividing the world into two spheres of influence. For all newly discovered lands, meaning newly discovered by Europeans, the eastern half of the entire world belonged to Portugal, and the western half belonged to Spain. The line of demarcation ended up at 46 degrees, 37 minutes west of the prime meridian of Greenwich, England, essentially going through modern-day Sao Paulo, Brazil. The Treaty of Tordesillas is the reason why just about all of the countries south of the United States and the Western Hemisphere speak Spanish, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. The Spanish created the first truly global empire. Except for Brazil, the Spanish Empire included most of South America and Central America. Spain also controlled a large portion of North America, essentially all of what is now Mexico, and a good part of what became the western part of the United States, along with Florida and some of the other areas around the Gulf of Mexico. This was an enormous territory. In addition to all of this property on the North American, Central American, and South American mainlands, the Spanish Empire included parts of Europe outside of the Iberian Peninsula, parts of Africa, as well as many islands, including, but not limited to, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the huge archipelago which now constitutes the Philippines. There are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines. The island of Hispaniola, which now encompasses the two countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was fought over between France and Spain, with each of them dominating at different times. As a result of this enormous empire, Spain was the most powerful country in the world for a couple of centuries. Starting in the early 1800s, there were a series of independence movements throughout the Western Hemisphere against Spanish rule. By the mid-1820s, all of what had been part of the Spanish Empire in South America, Central America, and North America mainlands had become independent countries. The once vast and mighty Spanish Empire was reduced to Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and a few other small colonies. I'll get into more details about the Philippines later, but let's start with Cuba. Here is a very brief history of Cuba. The Spanish first occupied Cuba in the early 1500s. Cuba remained a Spanish colony for almost 4 centuries. Cuba is by far the largest island in the Caribbean. It covers approximately 42,000 square miles or 110,000 square kilometers. To put that into perspective, Cuba accounts for somewhere around 1/2 of the total landmass of all of the Caribbean islands put together. The wealth of Cuba came from agriculture, primarily sugarcane, but also along with some tobacco and coffee. Starting in the 1860s, there were guerrilla wars against the Spanish as the Cubans sought independence, but Spain was able to hold on to control of Cuba. At various times, Americans were interested in acquiring Cuba. Here are the most serious attempts. In 1848, President James Polk authorized an offer of $100 million to buy Cuba from Spain. That would be worth approximately $4 billion in 2026. But the Spanish refused. During the time before the American Civil War, a lot of people in the southern states viewed Cuba as a great place for the expansion of slavery. Franklin Pierce was our 14th president from 1853 until 1857. Although he was a Yankee from New Hampshire, Pierce really sided with the slave states. He tried to make the Southerners happy by again trying to acquire Cuba. In 1854, the Pierce administration offered Spain $130 million for Cuba. That was a big increase in the purchase offer, but again, Madrid refused. There were some in the American government who thought that the U.S. should not take no for an answer. This was outlined in the Ostend Manifesto. That was an October 1854 written statement sent to the U.S. Secretary of State William Marcy, declaring the views of three American diplomats: Pierre Soule, the U.S. Minister to Spain; John Mason, the American Minister to France; and James Buchanan, Minister to Britain and later U.S. President. It got that name because these three guys met in Ostend, Belgium. The Ostend Manifesto said that if Spain refused to sell Cuba to the U.S., that America would be justified in simply seizing it by force. The alleged justification for such a seizure was national security based upon geography. Cuba is located just south of Florida, dominating the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. Here's a quote from the Ostend Manifesto. It must be clear to every reflecting mind that, from the peculiarity of its geographical position and the considerations attendant on it, Cuba is as necessary to the North American Republic as any of its present members, and that it belongs naturally to that great family of states of which the Union is the providential nursery. From its locality, it commands the mouth of the Mississippi and the immense and annually increasing trade which must seek this avenue to the ocean. Despite the Ostend Manifesto, the U.S. did not try to take Cuba by force. William McKinley was president during the Spanish-American War. He was elected in 1896. He was reelected in 1900, but was assassinated in 1901. In 1897, the McKinley administration offered Spain $300 million for Cuba. That would be worth close to $12 billion today. And again, Madrid said no. As I just outlined, the American government had a long-standing interest in acquiring Cuba to be part of the United States. But in the 1890s, there was a growing sentiment that the U.S. should not necessarily annex Cuba, but should intervene on behalf of the Cubans in their quest for independence. American newspapers started reporting about claimed atrocities against the Cuban people by their Spanish rulers. Two of the largest newspapers in the country were at the forefront of fanning the flames of these issues. One was the New York World, which was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and yes, that's the guy that the Pulitzer Prizes are named after. Those are the prizes that are given out each year for many categories in journalism, drama, and music. The other paper, with a very large circulation and a major interest in Cuban affairs, was the New York Journal, owned and operated by William Randolph Hearst. You may have heard of him. If you have ever visited California and driven along the coast between Los Angeles and San Francisco, you might have visited Hearst Castle. That was his estate along the central California coast at San Simeon. It's amazing. Other people have heard of William Randolph Hearst because of the movie Citizen Kane. That was a 1941 movie which was loosely based on Hearst's life. I know that some critics claim it's the greatest movie ever made. Not me. Even though it's 54 years old at this point, The Godfather still gets my vote for the all-time greatest movie. William Randolph Hearst was America's first media mogul. He owned newspapers across the country. At one point, he owned newspapers in 28 American cities, although I've seen some claims that he owned as many as 31 papers. In the 1920s, approximately 1/4 of all Americans received their news from a Hearst-owned newspaper. Besides the newspapers, in the 1930s, Hearst owned several magazines as well as 10 radio stations at different times. As a result, he had incredible influence on American public opinion. Pulitzer and Hearst both engaged in what was called yellow journalism. That term meant a style of reporting that was very sensationalized with shocking headlines and was often very fast and loose with the facts. The term came from a popular comic strip called The Yellow Kid. It was based upon a kid who wore a yellow nightshirt. The comic strip appeared at different times in both Pulitzer's New York World and Hearst's New York Journal. As a result, these newspapers were called Yellow Kid papers. Eventually, their style of reporting became known as yellow journalism. And that term stuck for all newspapers who focused more on scandals, sex, lurid details, and melodramatic stories than accurate, hard news reporting. Both Pulitzer and Hearst found that the stories of alleged atrocities against the Cuban people really boosted circulation for their newspapers. You know what else would boost newspaper sales? A war. The most famous anecdote about William Randolph Hearst is that he supposedly said about Cuba, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." I first heard that quote when I was in high school. It appeared in history textbooks. But where does it come from, and did he really say it? Frederick Remington was a famous painter and sculptor of scenes of the Old West. In December 1896, Hearst hired Remington to go to Cuba and draw sketches of the rebellion going on there. You may ask why Hearst sent an artist instead of a photographer. Before 1900, newspapers primarily relied on sketches instead of photographs because they were much easier to print. In January 1897, Remington supposedly sent a telegram to Hearst in New York which said, "Everything is quiet. There is no trouble here. There will be no war. I wish to return." Allegedly, Hearst replied by telegram, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." This story was always presented to explain how Hearst, through his media empire, pushed the United States into a war with Spain. Although this anecdote has been told over and over by journalists, historians, and a lot of other people, there doesn't seem to be any actual evidence for it. In looking into this matter, I have not been able to find any documentation for this exchange between Remington and Hearst. It does not appear that any telegrams between these two men have ever been found. Hearst always denied sending such a message, and yes, I get that he would certainly deny it. But when you think about it, why would he utter that phrase, "I'll furnish the war"? There already was a war going on in Cuba. The United States was not yet involved, but there was a war of rebellion between the Cuban natives versus the Spanish. It seems like this story first appeared in a memoir by a Canadian-born journalist named James Creelman. The title of the book was On the Great Highway, The Wanderings and Adventures of a Special Correspondent. It was published in 1901. His claimed story about Hearst is very suspect. The author, James Creelman, wasn't even in Cuba in January of 1897 when these telegrams were supposed to have been exchanged. He was in Europe at the time. So, either Creelman heard this story about Remington and Hearst secondhand, or he simply made it up. As far as I can tell, there is no actual evidence supporting this exchange between the artist and the publisher. But there are a lot of things like that in history. Sometimes things appear in a book and then it gets quoted by someone else. And then another person or entity quotes it in another book or article. And it snowballs until everybody believes that it's true. I don't know if we'll ever know if Hearst actually said that he would furnish the war, but my bet is that he probably did not say it. In addition to William Randolph Hearst, there's another larger-than-life character that played a significant role in the Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt. We all know him as Teddy Roosevelt, but he never liked that name. He referred to himself as Theodore, although when he was a little kid, he went by TD, not Teddy, TD. When he was president, he was often referred to in the press simply as TR. He was the first president known publicly by his initials. But speaking of the name Teddy, it is true that teddy bears are named after Teddy Roosevelt. Here's how that came about. Roosevelt was an avid hunter. In 1902, while he was president, TR was hunting bears in Mississippi. His guides found an old black bear and tied it to a tree for Roosevelt to come shoot it. He refused to do so since he considered that very unsportsmanlike, although he did instruct his guides to put the injured and suffering bear out of its misery. This story of Roosevelt refusing to shoot the bear made the newspapers. The incident became well known because of a cartoon in the Washington Post on November 16, 1902. The cartoon showed Roosevelt refusing to shoot the bear. After that, there were several cartoons throughout Roosevelt's presidency which featured small bears. A shopkeeper in Brooklyn was selling stuffed toy bears. And because of this story with the president, he named them Teddy's Bears. These stuffed animals became very popular and the store owner mass-produced them. And the term teddy bear caught on and is still used to this day. I won't be detailing his presidency in this episode, but I do want to give you a little bit of the background for Teddy Roosevelt leading up to this war. He was born in New York City on October 27, 1858. One of his earliest memories was watching a funeral procession for Abraham Lincoln in Manhattan. After Lincoln was assassinated, there were funeral events for him in several cities as his body and casket traveled by train to the burial place in Springfield, Illinois. There's actually a photograph taken on April 25, 1865, showing the Lincoln funeral procession in New York City. In that picture, you can see two little kids in a second-story window. One of those kids is 6-year-old Teddy Roosevelt. The other is his younger brother, Elliot. This was at their grandfather's house at 849 Broadway. Teddy Roosevelt grew up wealthy and well-educated. He went to Harvard and then attended 1 year of law school at Columbia. He married Alice Hathaway Lee. He loved politics. He was a member of the New York State Assembly in February 1884 when an incredible coincidence of horrible luck occurred. Roosevelt was in Albany when he received a telegram on February 13, 1884, that his wife had given birth to their first child the day before. Later that same day, he received another telegram that his wife was very ill. He took the train home to New York City, where Roosevelt and his wife lived with his mother. By the time he got there, his wife was seriously ill, and so was his mother. The doctors could not save either woman. His mother was only 48 years old when she died on February 14, 1884, from typhoid fever. Hours later on that same day, his wife also died. She was only 22 years old. She died of a kidney ailment, which at the time was called Bright's disease. It was the same illness which, a couple of years later, would cause the death of former President Chester Arthur on November 18, 1886, at his home in New York City when he was only 57 years old. That term Bright's disease is no longer used. This situation was absolutely dreadful. Within hours on Valentine's Day, 1884, Roosevelt lost his young wife and young mother. How he survived mentally is beyond me. Roosevelt kept a diary. On that date, he simply penned a large X and then wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." The baby was healthy. She was named Alice Lee Roosevelt after her mother. Roosevelt could not cope with these devastating emotional blows. In June 1884, approximately 4 months after the twin deaths of his wife and his mother, he left baby Alice with his sister and went off to the Dakota Territory and essentially became a cowboy. He owned the Elkhorn Ranch along the Little Missouri River in the Dakota Territory. Living in the West for a couple of years rejuvenated Roosevelt. He returned to New York in late 1886. He married his second wife, Edith Caro, although I've sometimes heard her last name pronounced Caro. Supposedly, Edith is the reason why the White House has the West Wing. If you're not familiar with that, it's that extension on the west side of the White House, which is the primary workplace for the president and the senior executive staff, containing the famous Oval Office. Before Roosevelt was president, the presidential offices were on the second floor of the White House, along with the living quarters for the president and his family. But since he had 6 kids while he was president, Edith supposedly pushed him to put an addition onto the White House and move the offices into that addition, which is now known as the West Wing, so there would be more room for the Roosevelt family on the second floor of the White House. Getting back to Roosevelt's return to New York from his time in the Dakota Territory, he married his second wife, Edith, on December 2, 1886. He and his new wife moved into the home, which he called Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay on Long Island. The house is still there. I toured it several years ago, and it's very cool. Go there if you can. Roosevelt re-entered politics and held a couple of positions before. In the spring of 1897, President McKinley appointed Roosevelt the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was serving in that capacity as the war with Spain approached. Besides the Spanish-American War, 1898 was a big year in American history. On January 1, 1898, the 5 boroughs consolidated into Greater New York. For a long time, New York City was limited to Manhattan Island. Then the city started spreading across the Harlem River into the Bronx. And then, on New Year's Day of 1898, Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island were consolidated into one enormous city. Just before that consolidation in 1898, New York was the largest city in America, and the independent city of Brooklyn was the 4th largest city. Of course, I'm talking about rankings by population. And since I know you're dying to know, Chicago was number 2 and Philadelphia was number 3. With apologies to Minneapolis and St. Paul, in the 1800s, when Americans referred to the Twin Cities, they meant New York and Brooklyn. Another major historical event in 1898 was the annexation of Hawaii. I don't have time to go into the whole story in this episode, but the short version is Americans who had moved to Hawaii gained more and more wealth and influence and eventually overthrew the monarchy so they could join the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. Getting back to today's topic, in January 1898, President McKinley ordered the American battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor in Cuba. This was done to supposedly protect American interests due to the conflict between the locals and the Spanish rulers. I've always found this amazing. The U.S. would never tolerate a foreign country's battleship to anchor in New York Harbor or on the Potomac River at Washington, D.C. You may have heard the battle cry, "Remember the Maine!" It references the explosion of the USS Maine on February 15, 1898, while it was anchored in Havana Harbor. The ship was destroyed, and between 260 and 268 of the 354 crew members were killed. Many people in the U.S. claim that it was sabotaged by the Spanish, probably an underwater mine. Of course, this was ridiculous, as provocative as it was for an American battleship to be anchored in the harbor of a Spanish colony. The government of Spain did not want to start a war with the United States. But the warmongers in America used the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," as a justification to go to war with Madrid. It is now generally believed that the Spanish did not blow up the American battleship. The explosion was probably an accident, most likely a coal bunker fire set off the magazine. And if you're not familiar with that term, a magazine is a secure storage area for ammunition and explosives on a ship. About a month after the explosion, a U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry ruled that the ship was probably blown up by an underwater mine. 13 years later, the wreck of the USS Maine was actually raised in Havana Harbor in 1911. Again, the Navy ruled that the Maine was blown up by an underwater mine. Finally, in 1976, U.S. Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover conducted a new investigation. Rickover came to the conclusion that the explosion was caused by spontaneous combustion in the ship's coal bins, which set off the ship's magazine. Nowadays, most historians accept the conclusion of the Admiral Rickover investigation that the explosion was caused by spontaneous combustion and not an underwater mine. In the spring of 1898, it didn't matter why the Maine exploded. The mere allegation that Spanish agents blew up a United States battleship was enough to convince a large segment of Americans that this country should go to war with Spain. On April 25, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. By the way, President McKinley could not just declare war. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the U.S. Constitution grants Congress the sole power to declare war. Before the official declaration of war, Congress passed a joint resolution on April 19, which was signed by President McKinley on April 20, 1898, authorizing the use of force against Spain. That joint resolution contained a provision known as the Teller Amendment. The key language of the Teller Amendment stated, "The United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people." Simply stated, the U.S. would not annex Cuba. Spain declared war on the United States on April 24, 1898. It's not that the Spanish officials were looking for a fight with America. This was in response to President McKinley ordering a naval blockade of Cuba on April 21. The Spanish interpreted the blockade as an act of war, which it essentially was, and then Congress made the war official with the declaration of war on April 25. Commodore George Dewey was the commander of the Asiatic Squadron of the U.S. Navy. On the day after war was declared, April 26, 1898, Dewey received the following orders: proceed at once to the Philippine Islands and initiate operations against the Spanish fleet. You must capture vessels or destroy. Use utmost endeavors. Dewey did not have any battleships like the USS Maine. The U.S. Asiatic Squadron consisted of 4 cruisers: the Olympia, the Baltimore, the Boston, and the Raleigh. These cruisers were modern steel-hulled ships. They were smaller than battleships. Dewey also had 2 gunboats, the Concord and Petrel, the revenue cutter McCulloch, and some coal supply ships. Dewey's flagship was the Olympia. Whenever you hear that term flagship, it simply means that the commanding officer was on that particular vessel. Fun fact, the USS Olympia is the oldest steel-hulled warship still afloat in the world. It was launched in 1892. It was decommissioned in 1922. It's now a floating museum, and you could visit it in Philadelphia. Here's something else interesting. The original unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery was an unidentified American casualty from France in World War I. His remains were transported to America from Europe on the USS Olympia. Although Dewey was in overall command of the Asiatic Squadron, the USS Olympia was commanded by Captain Charles Gridley. Today, Manila is the capital of the independent country of the Philippines. In early 1898, the Spanish used Manila as the capital of its Philippines colony. The Battle of Manila Bay occurred on May 1, 1898. The Spanish Pacific Squadron in the Philippines consisted of outdated cruisers and gunboats. They were anchored on both sides of the fortress at Cavite in Manila Bay, officially known as Fort San Felipe. This way, the Spanish ships could be protected by the large, land-based guns of the fortress. Around 5 o'clock in the morning on May 1, as dawn was breaking, the Battle of Manila Bay began. The Spanish shore batteries started firing at the Americans, but the Americans were not shooting back. Dewey wanted to wait until his ships were closer to the Spanish fleet and the fortress. Several sources I have read list the exact time as 5:41 a.m. when Commodore Dewey decided that they were close enough. He spoke to Captain Gridley of the USS Olympia with a line that would become famous in American history. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Once the flagship Olympia began shooting, all of the American ships fired their guns at the Spanish fortress and ships. After hours of fighting and many shells fired by both sides, it became clear to the Spanish commander that they had lost. The Spanish surrendered. The entire Spanish fleet was destroyed, some directly by damage from American firepower, and other Spanish ships were set on fire and scuttled by their crews so they would not be captured by the Americans. Although I've seen some differing figures, approximately 381 Spanish sailors or soldiers were killed or wounded during the Battle of Manila Bay. The Americans suffered only 8 or 9 wounded men. Amazingly, no Americans were killed in the Battle of Manila Bay. This was a resounding victory. Dewey did not have enough military personnel for a land campaign to seize and hold Manila. By the end of July 1898, 15,000 American troops arrived to take control of the Philippines. Before the U.S. Navy arrived, the native Filipinos had been conducting a revolutionary war of independence. The Spanish did not want to surrender the capital of Manila to the Filipino rebels. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. This set up a crazy farce. Representatives from the American and Spanish sides got together and agreed to conduct a mock battle for Manila. This occurred on August 13, 1898. American and Spanish forces fired their guns but tried not to kill each other. They were supposed to aim high to shoot over the opposing forces. After a while of shooting, the Spanish raised a white flag. This charade allowed the Spanish to save face by surrendering to the superior American forces rather than the local Filipinos who had been their colonial charges for the last 3 centuries. It also meant that the Americans could claim that they did not need help from the Filipino rebels. This was important since the U.S. was intent on keeping the Philippines instead of granting independence, which I'll explain in detail later on. This play acting by the Americans and Spanish was supposed to be a bloodless operation. I have read different figures, but it appears that the American forces suffered between 6 and 19 killed and between 40 to 43 wounded. The Spanish suffered approximately 49 killed and somewhere around 100 wounded. Remember earlier when I said that 15,000 American soldiers arrived in the Philippines at the end of July? Those 15,000 troops were on 3 transport ships that left Northern California headed towards the Philippines. On their way, the 3 troop ships stopped in Hawaii, where they were joined by a cruiser, the USS Charleston. And now it's time to talk about Guam. It's in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. I just measured on Google Maps. Guam is located about 1,400 miles or 2,200 kilometers east of the Philippines. It's the southernmost and largest island in the Mariana Islands archipelago. In the summer of 1944, during World War II, there were many battles between Japanese and American forces around the Mariana Islands. Once the U.S. had taken control of the main Mariana Islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they were used for the firebombing campaign of Japanese cities in 1945. And more significantly, the planes that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both launched from the island of Tinian. But for today's episode, we're focusing on Guam being a colony of Spain. The Spanish claimed Guam in the late 1500s, but did not really colonize the island until the mid-1600s. On June 20, 1898, the 4 American ships I mentioned earlier arrived at Apra Harbor on Guam. The Americans were surprised that there were no shots from the Spanish. So, the USS Charleston fired upon the fort at Santa Cruz. Still, there was no return fire upon the American cruiser. And then came a comical event that is something out of a movie with a terrible script. The Spanish officials did not know there was a war going on. They thought that the USS Charleston was firing salutes as a tribute to their Spanish hosts. So, Spanish military officials took a small boat out to the USS Charleston. The Spanish commanding officer said that he regretted that they did not have enough gunpowder to present a formal return salute to the American ships. These Spanish officials were then very surprised when the American captain told them that the United States and Spain were at war. The Americans demanded a surrender of the Spanish garrison. After a little negotiating, the Spanish authorities surrendered. How crazy of an incident is this? You couldn't make this up. This is how America captured Guam without a fight. We've covered the battles in the Pacific. Now let's talk about the war on and around the island of Cuba. By the way, there were no battles on or around the American mainland or Spain itself. In May 1898, the U.S. Navy blockaded the port of Santiago, Cuba. In June 1898, U.S. Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and additional troops landed near Santiago. The Battle of San Juan Heights was fought on July 1. This was for control of the high ground overlooking Santiago and its port. American forces won a complete victory. These land battles for the San Juan Heights were where Teddy Roosevelt became a national hero. As I explained earlier, Roosevelt had been serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In May 1898, he resigned because he wanted to personally fight in the war. Roosevelt formed a cavalry regiment which was officially called the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. But everybody remembers them by their nickname, the Rough Riders. That term Rough Riders came from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The nickname got applied to the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry by Richard Olahan, a reporter for the New York Sun. He referred to Roosevelt's Rough Riders in his newspaper stories, and the name caught on. Teddy Roosevelt may have been a pretty tough guy from his days working as a cowboy in the Dakota Territory, but for the Spanish-American War, he had some of his uniforms custom tailored by Brooks Brothers in New York City. He was very nearsighted, so he had several pairs of glasses in various parts of his uniform. When I was a kid, we always heard about how Teddy Roosevelt led a charge up San Juan Hill. That's not quite true. It was actually Kettle Hill in the San Juan Heights. The adjacent San Juan Hill was taken by other American troops. By the way, regiments of black soldiers were among the troops who captured Kettle Hill along with the Rough Riders. After capturing the San Juan Heights, American forces were positioned overlooking the city of Santiago and its harbor. The commander of the Spanish fleet worried that the American army would destroy his ships with land-based fire. So, the Spanish admiral tried to lead the Spanish fleet out of Santiago Harbor on July 3. As I explained earlier, American ships had blockaded Santiago Harbor and met the Spanish ships as they tried to flee. The U.S. Navy sunk or destroyed all 6 of the Spanish ships. According to the Navy History and Heritage Command website, Spanish casualties were 223 men killed, 151 wounded, and 1,720 captured. Only 1 American seaman was killed in the battle, and none of the American vessels suffered significant damage. In the late spring and summer of 1898, there were some land and naval battles on and around Puerto Rico. I'm going to skip over these because the Spanish-American War was essentially over within 3 months. By late July, the Spanish government asked for peace terms. The American attitude about this war was summed up by the U.S. ambassador to Britain, John Hay. In September 1898, Hay was appointed U.S. Secretary of State by President McKinley. He still held that cabinet position when Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. John Hay had a fascinating career which began during the Civil War when he was one of Abraham Lincoln's 2 personal secretaries. Hay and the other secretary, John Nicolay, lived in the White House while working for Lincoln throughout the Civil War. Hay and Nicolay wrote a multi-volume biography of their hero, President Lincoln. Regarding today's subject, John Hay famously described the Spanish-American conflict as a splendid little war. Here is the full quote from a letter that Hay wrote to Theodore Roosevelt on July 27, 1898. It has been a splendid little war, begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave. A ceasefire was signed on August 12, 1898, titled The Protocol of Peace. That was one day before the mock Battle of Manila I described earlier. It appears that the American and Spanish forces in the Philippines had not received word of the ceasefire. The war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. In histories of this war, it's often stated that, pursuant to the peace treaty, Cuba was granted independence. But that's not quite true. I've read the December 10, 1898 Treaty of Paris. By the way, I think it's so cool that you can look up the exact language of a treaty from the 1800s. Anyway, this is how Article 1 of that treaty deals with Cuba. Spain relinquishes all claim of sovereignty over and title to Cuba, and, as the island is, upon its evacuation by Spain, to be occupied by the United States will, so long as such occupation shall last, assume and discharge the obligations that may, under international law, result from the fact of its occupation for the protection of life and property. As you can see, Cuba wasn't actually granted independence. Spain was just surrendering any claims and allowing the United States to occupy the island. We'll discuss this more in a little bit. Pursuant to the Treaty of Paris, Guam and Puerto Rico were ceded to the United States, and Spain sold the Philippines to the U.S. for the sum of $20 million. Of course, these matters were just decided between the Americans and the Spanish. Nobody consulted with the people living on Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines. There were some people in the U.S. who wanted to keep Cuba, but it would really look bad that America went to war to supposedly help the Cubans win their independence and then keep that island as an American territory. Further, as I explained earlier, the Teller Amendment stated that the U.S. would not annex Cuba. The United States occupied Cuba from 1898 until 1902, when Cuba became fully independent. But Congress had specific terms for when American forces would be removed from Cuba. These terms are known as the Platt Amendment. Here is how that policy is described on the U.S. State Department website. The Platt Amendment, an amendment to a U.S. Army Appropriations Bill, established the terms under which the United States would end its military occupation of Cuba, which had begun in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and leave the government in control of the island of Cuba to its people. While the amendment was named after Senator Orville Platt of Connecticut, it was drafted largely by Secretary of War Elihu Root. The Platt Amendment laid down 8 conditions to which the Cuban government had to agree before the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the transfer of sovereignty would begin. The Platt Amendment's conditions prohibited the Cuban government from entering into any international treaty that would compromise Cuban independence or allow foreign powers to use the island for military purposes. The United States also reserved the right to intervene in Cuban affairs in order to defend Cuban independence and to maintain a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. Other conditions of the amendment demanded that the Cuban government implement plans to improve sanitary conditions on the island, relinquish claims on the Isle of Pines, now known as the Isla de la Juventud, and agreed to sell or lease territory for coaling and naval stations to the United States. This clause ultimately led to the perpetual lease by the United States of Guantanamo Bay. Finally, the amendment required the Cuban government to conclude a treaty with the United States that would make the Platt Amendment legally binding, and the United States pressured the Cubans to incorporate the terms of the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution. That last line is so significant. Although the Cubans initially refused, the American officials made it clear that U.S. troops weren't leaving the island unless these terms were included in the Cuban Constitution. The Platt Amendment remained in force until 1934, when both sides agreed to cancel the treaties that enforced it. Overall, I think that's a pretty fair and accurate summary of this situation by the U.S. State Department website. Officially, Cuba became independent on May 20, 1902, when the U.S. flag was lowered and American occupation ended. The Republic of Cuba was inaugurated under its first president, Tomás Estrada Palma. Now let's talk about Guantanamo Bay. Most people had not even heard of Guantanamo Bay until the U.S. government started holding prisoners there following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, when planes were flown into the Pentagon and the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. But did you ever wonder why the U.S. had a military base in Cuba? When you think about it, it's awfully strange that the U.S. has a military base in a country with whom the U.S. did not have diplomatic relations from 1961 through 2015. Here's how the U.S. Navy website explains it. Located on the southeast corner of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay's strategic location and topographic properties have made it a valued possession of maritime powers since the 15th century. Christopher Columbus landed at the bay on his second voyage to the Americas, and it was later contested by the empires of England, France, and Spain. In 1898, the bay was taken by U.S. forces and their Cuban allies for use as a forward operating base in their effort to wrest Spanish control of the island. In 1903, the United States leased 45 square miles of land and water at Guantanamo Bay from the newly independent Cuban government to be used for fleet sustainment by the growing U.S. Navy. A 1934 treaty reaffirming the lease granted Cuba and her trading partners free access through the bay, modified the lease payment from $2,000 in gold coins per year to the 1934 equivalent value of $4,085 US dollars, and added a requirement that termination of the lease requires the consent of both the U.S. and Cuban governments or the U.S. abandonment of the base property. Base relations with Cuba remained stable and did not significantly change until the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s, with United States and Cuban relations steadily declining as revolutionary leader Fidel Castro aligned with the Soviet Union. The United States severed diplomatic ties with Cuba in 1961, and in 1964, Castro cut off water and supply avenues to the base. Since then, Naval Station Guantanamo Bay has been self-sufficient with its own power and water sources. The Spanish-American War and the subsequent treaties provided the United States with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the base at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The U.S. still possesses all three today. What happened with the U.S. occupation of the Philippines? Before I get into that, how did the Philippines become a Spanish colony? Most of the Spanish Empire was in the Western Hemisphere, but the Philippines are on the opposite side of the world. It was because of Ferdinand Magellan. He was a Portuguese explorer who sailed on behalf of Spain. If there's one thing that most people know about Ferdinand Magellan, it's that he was the first person to sail completely around the world. To start with, that's not true, at least regarding Magellan himself. One of the ships under his command made it all the way around the Earth, but Magellan died along the way. Magellan's expedition, called the Armada de Molucca, left Spain on September 20, 1519 with 5 ships. The expedition sailed down around the southern part of South America into the Pacific. Eventually, one of those 5 original ships sailed from the Pacific through the Indian Ocean, down around the southern tip of Africa, and back to Spain. On March 16, 1521, Magellan's expedition reached the Philippines. This was the first time Europeans had visited the Philippines. It was the Spanish that later named this archipelago the Philippines after King Philip II of Spain. On April 27, 1521, Magellan was killed on the island of Mactan in the Philippines. 44 years after Magellan's visit to the Philippines, Spain created its first permanent colony there in 1565. The archipelago remained a Spanish colony until 1898. As I explained earlier, pursuant to the Treaty of Paris, the U.S. bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. Officially, the United States has never had colonies. We are a republic. We don't have colonies. We do have territories. Of course, you can argue that that is simply semantics. America still has territories today. Puerto Rico and Guam are prime examples. The U.S. managed the Philippines as a territory until independence was finally granted on July 4, 1946, 1 year after World War II. Although earlier, in 1935, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was established with semi-autonomy. They elected their own president and were somewhat self-governing, but the U.S. maintained a military presence in those islands. But the locals did not want to wait decades for sovereignty. The people of the Philippines wanted to have their own independent country immediately after the Spanish left. They did not want to be a part of the United States. The Filipinos demonstrated this with an armed insurrection. As I explained earlier, there were approximately 15,000 U.S. troops occupying the Philippines by the end of July 1898. On January 23, 1899, the Filipinos declared an independent republic and set up a capital at Malolos. American officials did not recognize this independent republic. Fighting between Filipinos and Americans started on February 4, 1899, in what has become known as the Philippine-American War. At the beginning of this episode, I said that a lot of people have never heard of the Spanish-American War. This war is even more obscure. I could not find any polls as to what percentage of current Americans have heard of the Philippine-American War. My bet is that the percentage is very low. Here's the answer I got from Google on this subject. Historical research and educational analyses consistently conclude that the vast majority of Americans are unaware of the Philippine-American War. When the armed fighting began on February 4, 1899, the U.S. had approximately 20,000 troops in the Philippines. The Nationalist Army of Liberation of the Philippines had 40,000 troops plus local militia. Although the Americans were greatly outnumbered, the Filipinos were not well trained and were not equipped as well as the U.S. soldiers. By the end of March 1899, American forces had captured Manila and the self-proclaimed capital at Malolos. The U.S. sent additional soldiers to the Philippines. The locals realized that their best chance was in guerrilla fighting instead of formal battles. I think this is an accurate description of this horrendous war from the U.S. State Department website. The war was brutal on both sides. U.S. forces at times burned villages, implemented civilian reconcentration policies, and employed torture on suspected guerrillas, while Filipino fighters also tortured captured soldiers and terrorized civilians who cooperated with American forces. Many civilians died during the conflict as a result of the fighting, cholera and malaria epidemics, and food shortages caused by several agricultural catastrophes. On July 4, 1902, the U.S. officially proclaimed the insurrection, as the American government always referred to this war, was over, but sporadic fighting continued. A total of approximately 126,000 American soldiers served at one time or another in the Philippines between 1899 and 1902. Of those U.S. troops, approximately 1,000 died in battle or of wounds received in combat, about 3,000 more died of disease and other causes, and nearly another 3,000 were wounded. Certainly, those deaths and injuries were tragic, but compare those figures to the casualties for the Filipinos. Approximately 20,000 Filipino combatants died during the Philippine-American War. And although we don't have accurate figures, it's estimated that somewhere around 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, or disease. From the time that the U.S. purchased the Philippines from Spain up until now, there has always been a controversy as to whether the U.S. should have occupied the archipelago as a territory. The argument was that if the U.S. did not do it, that either Japan or Germany would take over these islands because of their strategic position. Considering the expansive nature of both Japan and Germany at the turn of the 20th century, this was a valid concern. This was evidenced by the fact that in 1898, several German warships visited the Philippines. Of course, there were also people in the American government who wished to control the Philippines to extract its resources and to help trade throughout Asia. Supposedly, Senator Mark Hanna said something to the effect of controlling the Philippines would enable the United States to take a large slice of the commerce of Asia. I was unable to find when and where Senator Hanna actually said that. But I always thought that the U.S. should have granted independence to the Philippines right after the Spanish-American War, but kept a couple of military bases there, kind of the way that America kept Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. I am not saying that America is automatically entitled to have military bases in any foreign country that it wishes, but this certainly would have been a better alternative than to treat the Philippines as a territory or a colony when the people there clearly wanted independence. And I think most historians believe that if the U.S. completely withdrew from the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, that either the Japanese or Germans would have seized the archipelago, with no thought of eventual independence. There are times in history and politics when you cannot achieve the ultimate goal, but you have to choose the best alternative available. I think the U.S. could have avoided Japan, Germany, or some other country acquiring the Philippines by, number one, having strong military bases in the archipelago. Number two, making it clear to all other countries that, although the Philippines were an independent country, the U.S. was safeguarding that independence. Obviously, we will never know. But I think that this was a way of granting the Filipinos their independence like the Cubans received. As I stated earlier, the Spanish-American War essentially ended the Spanish Empire. But it also had drastic effects on the United States. After this conflict with Spain, America was viewed as a world power for the first time. The war with Spain also gave us the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. After the battle for the San Juan Heights, Roosevelt became a national hero. As a result of his fame, he was elected governor of New York in November 1898. William McKinley was elected president in 1896, and his vice president was Garrett Hobart from New Jersey. The most significant thing that Hobart did occurred on February 14, 1899. This involved the Bacon Amendment. That was a proposed addition to a joint resolution by the U.S. Senate to clarify the status of the Philippines following the Treaty of Paris ending the Spanish-American War. The critical wording of the Bacon Amendment declared that the United States had no intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said islands, meaning the Philippines, and assert the determination, when a stable and independent government shall have been erected there, to transfer to said government upon terms which shall leave the government and control of the islands to their people at the proper time. The vote in the Senate on the Bacon Amendment was tied. Pursuant to Article 1, Section 3, Clause 4 of the U.S. Constitution, the Vice President votes when there is a tie in the Senate. That clause reads, "The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided." Hobart voted against the proposed Bacon Amendment that would have granted independence to the Philippines. Hobart died of heart disease on November 21, 1899, at age 55. He was one of 7 vice presidents to die in office. In 1967, the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. Prior to the 25th Amendment, when a president died in office, the vice president became president. The office of vice president would remain vacant until the next scheduled election. If a vice president died, there was also the same situation where there would be no vice president until the next election. Under Section 2 of the 25th Amendment, a vacancy in the office of the vice president is filled by the president nominating somebody and then Congress confirming that person with a majority vote by both the House of Representatives and the Senate. The reason I'm bringing it up in this episode, when Garrett Hobart died in 1899, there was no vice president until William McKinley was reelected president in 1900. McKinley's new vice president was Theodore Roosevelt. On September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz. He died 8 days later on September 14, and Roosevelt became president. Most people think that JFK was our youngest president. Not true. John Kennedy was the youngest person to be elected president at age 43, but Teddy Roosevelt was only 42 years old when McKinley died. Roosevelt went on to become one of our greatest presidents. He's one of the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore. And in case you don't know the other 3, they are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. Here are some of the good things that TR achieved as president. Of course, this is not a complete list. Let's start with conservation. He placed approximately 230 million acres, or 930,000 square kilometers, of land under federal protection. Roosevelt founded the U.S. Forest Service. He set aside 150 national forests. He created 4 national game preserves and 51 national bird reservations. He established 5 national parks as well as several national monuments. Some of you may be wondering, what's the difference between a national park and a national monument? Both national parks and national monuments are federally protected lands. The main difference is the method of creation. National parks can only be established through an act of Congress. However, national monuments can be established by presidential proclamation under the Antiquities Act of 1906, although Congress can also designate national monuments. Once Teddy Roosevelt had the authority to create what was essentially a national park simply by calling it a national monument, he created 18 national monuments, including the Grand Canyon, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and the Petrified Forest in Arizona, although the Grand Canyon and the Petrified Forest were later redesignated as national parks. How about TR's other domestic policies besides conservation? The Roosevelt administration filed 44 lawsuits against monopolies using the Sherman Antitrust Act. The most famous one resulted in the breakup of the Northern Securities Company Railroad Trust. These monopolies were strangling small businesses throughout the country and costing Americans countless dollars due to a lack of competition. In 1906, TR was instrumental in the passage of the Meat Inspection Act as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act. Before these laws, companies could put anything in our food and drugs, including many toxic chemicals like embalming fluid or dangerous drugs like opium, heroin, and cocaine. TR was also great in foreign policy. In 1906, Roosevelt became the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize due to his mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. That Nobel Peace Prize was well deserved. It would take far too long to list all of Roosevelt's accomplishments as president. The important point for today's episode is the fact that he probably never would have become president if not for the Spanish-American War. If he did not become nationally known as a war hero fighting in Cuba, it is very doubtful that he would have been McKinley's running mate in 1900, which led to his presidency. The 8 years of Theodore Roosevelt as president was arguably the best thing, at least for America, to come out of the Spanish-American War. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. Spotify does not allow reviews for an entire podcast. However, you can comment and review a particular episode. Of course, I'd appreciate any kind words in a review of this episode. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to leave a review. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find fun links for all the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.